Peter Jennings here. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, talking today to Michael Outram of the Australian Border Force. Michael, great to have you with us. I don't normally go through people's CVs, but I thought you have a really interesting one, and I wanted to share with our viewers some of your background experience. So Michael was sworn in as Commissioner of Australian Border Force on the 14th of May 2018, but bringing 30 years of law enforcement experience in a range of areas: community policing, covert operations, criminal intelligence, protective and major event security, public order management, and investigating terrorism, transactional organised crime and corruption. Prior to being sworn in as Commissioner of the ABF, Michael led the operations group of the Border Force responsible for compliance and enforcement operations relating to the movement of travellers and goods through the border. From 2011, Michael served as Assistant Commissioner with the Australian Federal Police and had responsibility for the AFP's national protection function. In 2014, Michael was the AFP's operational commander for the G20 summit in Brisbane and also for the response to the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over the Ukraine. Michael's also worked at the national and international level in establishing overseas joint agency investigations, intelligence operations and task forces dealing with serious organised crime. In 2004, Michael was also appointed as Executive Director of the Serious and Organised Crime at the Australian Crime Commission. With peers from the Federal Police and the Australian Taxation Office, Michael established Operation Wickenby in 2004, creating a framework for future joint agency operations, which led to significant recovery of revenue. Michael came to Australia in 2002, commenced working in the Independent Commission Against Corruption in New South Wales as the Executive Director of Strategic Operations. And before that, Michael, a 20-year law enforcement career with the London Metropolitan Police Service starting in 1980. Michael was also awarded the Australian Police Medal in 2014. What a fascinating career, Michael. It's been one that's obviously had some really strong common themes around law enforcement, organised crime, now the border, of course. Thanks so much for joining us today. And how we're going to run the webinar is Michael is going to begin with an opening statement, 10 or 12 minutes or so of his thoughts as Border Force Commissioner. Then I'll be engaging in a discussion with Michael about issues emerging from his speech and some policy matters of concern to Border Force. And then through the magic of technology, Michael will be taking some questions from people who are watching us today. So that's the plan. And with that, Michael, let me hand over to you to hear your opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Peter, and thank you for that introduction. And thanks to you and your team and ASPI for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. It's a real privilege to be with you and your viewers on this webinar. And I'd like to share with you some thoughts and some insights about the Australian Border Force and how we're now preparing ourselves for the future as we go through and emerge from COVID-19, the global pandemic. It is, of course, 5 years this year since the establishment of the Australian Border Force, and as we enter our 6th year, I'd say that we've established ourselves really in our credentials really as Australia's Customs and Border Law Enforcement Agency. And we've shown that we have a disciplined, professional and capable workforce that is operationally competent and highly effective in prosecuting our many responsibilities, some of which I'll share with you now, very varied. And we are able to adapt, and we've shown we can adapt to changing threats and priorities with agility. And I think, frankly, COVID-19, at times we've surprised ourselves with the speed and agility that we've actually had in our operational DNA. For example, the way we've had to progressively implement border restrictions and measures since late January, which has ultimately led to us closing our international borders to all but returning citizens and permanent residents and exempt travellers, of course. And at the same time, we've had to significantly refocus our resources from people who are working in airports, of course, because we've got very few travellers returning to Australia, to facilitate the essential goods to be moved across our border. We've had to create new services, for example, processes to exempt travellers, tens of thousands that are seeking to enter or leave Australia. And we've worked hard, of course, to keep COVID-19 out of our detention centres around the country successfully so far. We've coordinated operations across government to establish quarantine facilities on Christmas Island and at Howard Springs in the Northern Territory. We managed to do that within days of government decisions. And of course, we implemented a cruise ship ban and we've managed the removal of all remaining cruise ships from Australia. So it's been a busy few months for us. And I might just, though, Peter, go back to last year, the Prime Minister's call to arms, really, to the public service, where he encouraged the public service leaders to focus on delivering services for Australians and spoke about congestion busting and economic prosperity. And of course, as we go through COVID-19 now, you see that call to arms, in fact, has been amplified now for us, and particularly in the Border Force this year. As a collective public service, our goal is clear. We need to help Australia recover economically from COVID-19. And that's the legacy, frankly, that we need to leave for future generations of Australians. In the Border Force, though, we have a big role to play in economic recovery, but at the same time, we've got to keep pace with evolving security threats and issues to help protect Australians from those who wish to do us harm. We have to ensure that legitimate traders and travellers are not disadvantaged by onerous layers of security and red tape, to the Prime Minister's call to arms, and be able to make precision strikes in the border system against people or activities that present risk. And at the same time, again, facilitate everything else that industry needs to do to generate economic recovery at lightning speed, or at least without undue delays. So working closely with industry is going to be the centerpiece for us. Industry obviously hasn't got, there's economically stretched, the government's economically stretched. So collaboration and partnership will have to be the mantra to navigate our way through the remainder of the pandemic and beyond. And our national and international counterparts and relationships there will be even more essential as we move into 2021 and beyond. We have the opportunity, though, to leverage the significant knowledge and skills and the innovation of industry to work together to refine the technology and the systems that both strengthen security and at the same time enhance the facilitation of the movement of people and goods across the border, and at the same time minimise the loss of duty and revenue. To help to achieve these objectives, the ABF, I'm relocating a number of our senior officers into Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth from October this year. And that's not just a cosmetic change, that's actually to give effect to the reality that delivery for us in terms of that engagement with industry, with our stakeholders and with our workforce isn't in Canberra. We need to be more present in those larger cities and around the border. So that's the start of a move within the ABF to a completely different operating model that will be essential to enable us to deliver on our commitments to government over the coming years. The SDS team, the senior executive team in the ABF, will have to work differently. High levels of collaboration, and they'll need to rise above their individual functional, geographic and representational areas of focus to deliver nationally. And so this change is a first step towards that new operating model, as I've said, and we're undertaking also with industry a transformative agenda to simplify our trade system to support our economic growth and recovery. This is a whole of government initiative, I should say. So the ABF is one of numerous organisations, government organisations that operate at the border. There are over 200 laws and regulations that are in play at the border. It's a very complex system, the border. And of course, we need to adopt best practice compliance and regulation processes and approaches supported by cost-effective technologies, business systems, data analytics, and a modern workforce. We're also progressing development of a single trade window, a one-stop shop for industry to engage with all of those layers of bureaucracy and regulations at the border. And ultimately, this will enable industry and government to have access to more accurate and timely information on the status of goods, increasing predictability and certainty for scheduling and logistics. So built on a solid foundation of streamlined regulations and standardised data and a single trade window, this would increase our overall level of competitiveness in our global supply chains and improve our responsiveness in times of economic crisis, increasing visibility of supply chains for government and for industry. And that'll allow us to manage disruptions and enable targeted responses in a far more streamlined way. Efficient facilitation of trade is therefore important to economic recovery, but also it means it's interlinked with, and we can't forget about, the security side of that coin. Australia needs strong defences to ensure that our community is protected from illicit and prohibited goods, narcotics, for example, and the ABF's got to continue within that facilitated border system. We have to continue to detect, disrupt and deter the crimes perpetrated by transnational serious and organised crime at the border. And to achieve this, we've got to have a layered approach to border screening, for example, of cargo. This requires the increased use in the future of supply chain data to inform intelligence and analytics that identify vulnerabilities in the cargo supply chains and enable intelligence analytics to focus intervention efforts on entities and goods, of course, that represent the highest levels of threat. We've also, though, at the same time, I think, got to boost our ability to screen larger volumes of cargo and goods at scale and at speed. And that, of course, will require in the future more contemporary border screening technologies to be developed, but not just developed by us in partnership with industry, because in the future, if we're going to get the benefits of automation, machine learning, and industry knowledge, rather than bolting them onto the supply chain, we have to integrate them in the supply chain. And that means that the paradigm of trust and collaboration with industry has to shift from where it will have to in the future, shift from where it is today. And we are, of course, learning from our international counterparts and their experiences with border screening. And an example would be the Dutch port of Rotterdam, where they're increasingly embedding their technologies in the logistics flow, providing time and cost savings for industry. And in fact, I'm having a conversation with the head of Dutch Customs tonight in relation to just catching up on what they're up to in the Netherlands. So our challenge is to be innovative in detecting illicit goods and to keep pace with the constantly evolving methodologies of criminals. And while the pandemic has disrupted air and land trafficking routes, transnational serious and organised crime groups remain flexible and are turning to alternative methods to import their illicit goods. And with the reduction in travellers, we have actually moved a lot of ABF officers from passenger terminals to cargo and mail centres to respond to these increased threats. And as a result, I'll give you some examples. In the first 6 months of 2020, there were over 9,800 detections of drugs and precursors at our border. That's a 19% increase on the same period last year. And we're using technology, intelligence analysis, and the skills of our officers to detect those goods and keep on top of the latest trends and concealment methods. Of course, criminals use a variety of concealment methods, and we've got to constantly keep up to date with what they're up to. But, hiding things in children's toys, clothing, beauty products, furniture, and sometimes in plain sight. In March, at a sea cargo examination facility in Sydney, we stopped 160 litres of liquid methamphetamine worth $80 million, and that was being smuggled in bottles of water. And so more recently, opportunistic criminals have hidden drugs inside personal protective equipment because of the change in the environment there. And last month, so we found 600 litres of liquid methamphetamine concealed in coconut water. The serious point here is that the wastewater analysis by the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission indicates there's about 8 tonnes of methamphetamine being consumed in Australia each year. We detect about 8 to 9 tonnes at the border, which means that the rest is being brought into Australia. What I would say is we think, often by trusted insiders, the UNODC estimate that around 70% of importations by sea container use trusted insiders. That's people who are employed in the supply chain internationally. So we're focusing on strengthening supply chain integrity and working with federal, state and territory law enforcement intelligence partners to reduce the threat of serious and organised crime at the border. The modernisation and diversification of supply chains provides an opportunity for the ABF and its partners with the availability of richer supply chain information and data to enable the facilitation of trade and at the same time, of course, target those threats. Peter, I've got a lot more information in my brief here that I won't take into time because I think we're going to get a lot of value out of a conversation. But what I would also add is that, of course, we are also present through Maritime Border Command. It's a multi-agency task force within the Australian Border Force that plays a key role in detecting, deterring, and responding to attempted illegal migration and smuggling by sea. And of course, we do have a Rear Admiral from the Navy who leads that task force within the ABF, who's also sworn in as Assistant Commissioner of the Australian Border Force. And he's able to command both defence and border force assets in responding to civil maritime threats around our oceans. And of course, we have about 10 million square kilometres of exclusive economic zone that we have to patrol and look after. And you can only imagine the amount of surveillance and data that's being managed within that particular command. But Peter, I might just, in wrapping up, just to sort of pull a few threads together here for people listening, say COVID-19 has caused the ABF and me to reflect seriously on how we contribute to both our prosperity and security in the future. And we have at times taken roles on in the last few months that are unfamiliar to us. And we've been agile and nimble in our response, but we've also learned from our response and from where we made mistakes. And we've developed new partnerships and connections and networks, and we've deepened others through the pandemic. And we're progressing initiatives that will streamline trade and ensure our border systems are as efficient and secure as they can be to aid our economic recovery. And thank you for your time. I'm happy now to engage in a conversation with
thank you. That's fascinating. Every time I talk to you, I'm just struck by the so many different moving parts that you're part of the system is responsible for, and this interaction of prosperity and security. In some ways, those factors kind of push against each other. I mean, we have such an interconnected economy. And if there's one thing that COVID has shown us, it's the absolute reliance on just-in-time supply chain links that connect us in so many ways to the rest of the world. And here you are in Australian Border Force having to sort of oversee the flow of this material into the country. On the one hand, you've got the Prime Minister saying to you, well, you facilitate the trade, make it happen quickly. On the other hand, you have probably the same person saying to you, but keep us secure, Michael. And do you think this impact of globalization and the sort of just-in-time nature of supply chains has made your work more complicated over the years?
In a way, yes, because of the volume. Managing volume simply is the challenge for us at the border, and that's a good thing economically. I mean, before COVID-19, passenger numbers were going up year on year on year and projected to go further. The amounts of goods coming through sea cargo, air cargo, and international mail going up. So the challenge for us has been how to screen more goods with the same amount of resources. You're right, though. I think the agile supply chains have created a border that's organic in nature.
Yes.
An example of that would be where, because of the restrictions and lockdowns in the state of Victoria, air cargo has had to be brought in through Sydney. So whilst the air cargo numbers were already at Christmas levels, we've had to add on top of that a cargo that was previously going into the state of Victoria. And so that stretched our ability to screen goods, and we're having to work very closely with DHL and FedEx and TNT and those organisations to make sure that we don't block them and block the supply chain, but at the same time we quit our responsibilities. It can be quite challenging.
We were talking before we went on air about the revenue function that you're also responsible for as well. Can you give us a bit of insight into that? How much money do you raise for the Commonwealth?
About $20 billion a year. And,
$20 billion.
$20 billion, and it's something that's not often known. We're the second biggest collector of revenue after the tax office in Australia. So we contribute quite a bit through our compliance and collection activities to the revenue base.
I mean, can you say how compliant is the business world to that? Are there attempts to be avoiding that type of duties? Or?
It's a very good question. I think the vast majority of exporters and importers are honest. They pay their way, and they want a level playing field. In other words, they want everyone else to pay their way too. Unfortunately, as with every system, there are a few people in there that are either criminal or seeking to avoid paying their dues. And just last year, we discovered something called a duty drawback fraud, where people have been criminally charged now, and with the AFP criminal assets confiscation team, we've restrained $70 million worth of assets. But the overall value of the revenue at risk there was about $500 million.
Goodness, yeah, wow. And on the other side of the ledger, the security side, so there was a report overnight about Braden Bathurst confiscating arms. Can you give us a little insight into what that was about?
So there's a great example of what happens at the border. Firearms and firearms parts are imported by Australians through the border, sometimes through mail from other countries, sometimes through air cargo or sea cargo, sometimes whole firearms or firearms parts. And of course, that can end up with somebody in our community being seriously harmed. So in that particular case, we obviously latched on to that intelligence. We built up the picture. We worked with New South Wales Police and other partners, and overnight in Bathurst, made a big splash in the media this morning locally. There was a raid conducted in Bathurst yesterday that's led to the arrest of an individual and the recovery of a lot of evidence. So that's a small example of what goes on every day for the Australian Border Force, whether it's firearms parts or other things.
And of course, the other dimension to that is that you are working with a significant number of partners at the state level, like state police forces, for example. So again, there's many many cogs in this machine that you're responsible for dealing with.
So you can't separate, I think, the international border and the Commonwealth's responsibilities there from what happens in the states and territories. Wherever you look, there's a connection between, the border and the Commonwealth level and the states and territories. So a current example of that would be, I've just mentioned, the diversion of goods from Victoria into New South Wales in the supply chain. The impact of quarantine capacities within the states and territories requiring caps on the number of passengers that can travel to Australia, which is currently obviously, it's a current issue as people are talking about and thinking about. And if you go back to the way that the medical response to COVID is being played out for returning travellers from overseas, it's impossible to separate out in a very clean way the international border and sort of say that there isn't a relationship there with what's happening in states and territories. There's an inextricable link and this sort of almost symbiotic relationship.
Let's go to COVID, because obviously this is dominating and had such a major impact on so many parts of the economy and how we respond to things. How has organised crime changed its business model to deal with COVID?
A simple example of that would be, with border closures within Australia, criminals would have to think differently about how they transport, say, narcotics across a state border. And so where previously criminal groups may have been transporting narcotics by road, that may well for us at the international border would mean that they're going to now start trying to fly them in internationally or bring them in through international mail, through sea cargo or air cargo. So and we've seen changes in a lot of sort of volumetric changes at the border. So air cargo and mail consignments, people are sitting at home, online shopping, it's gone gangbusters. That's great for people at home, consumers, that sort of supply chain flexibility. But for us, it means there's a chance there's going to be items concealed within those flows that shouldn't be there, drugs, firearms parts, wherever it might be. Also, importations by small craft. In the media recently, you would have heard about a small craft off the coast of Newcastle. It was a significant 1.8 tonnes of narcotics in that particular attempted importation by small craft and sea. I talked to them about 32,000 nautical miles of coastline in Australia that we have to look after.
I want to come back to containers and parcels in a minute, but you remind me also of a story about perhaps 2 weeks ago now of a light aircraft that actually crashed in Papua New Guinea, which turned out to be carrying drugs, which I guess were clearly bound for Northern Australia. What's the story there about those sorts of, I guess, illegal light aircraft movements coming into the north of the country? Do you see much of that? Yeah, we do, and we work very closely with the Australian Federal Police and, of course, the ADF in relation to a lot of those issues. I would say that in the future, though, the range of these light aircraft, the speed of these light aircraft, just the number of airstrips across the top end of Australia, we're going to have to be more vigilant, not just looking what's on our water, the seas around Australia, but also looking to the sky to try and understand what's the pattern of activity of these sorts of aircraft and where are the sort of pressure points for us and where's the risks. I think there's a lot more work in the future for us to do in that regard, particularly as, say, PNG and West Papua and other countries in the archipelago start to open up and become, if you imagine if infrastructure south of the Fly River in PNG made it more accessible for criminals to transport goods to that part of PNG, that would be a problem for us. I guess geography protects us to some degree from drones and drone technology, although we are now seeing larger scale commercially available ones. But are you aware of sort of illegal use of drones that might become a problem for Australia in future?
Yeah, not so much in terms of long-range importation of narcotics, but certainly drones being used, for example, to drop narcotics into prisons or detention centres.
Yes.
And so, the idea, you can expand on that idea and that logic thread and see how they could become a problem in the future.
Yes.
And, of course, submersible technologies as well. So I think the future will have to be far more on the lookout for those sorts of technologies and those sorts of methodologies that are being used by criminals. There's no doubt that criminals will have the money and the resources to turn to those when they become more commercially available.
Yes. Okay, let's go back to containers and the post, those types of courier services. Can you give us a sense of the quantity increase that we've seen as a result of COVID? I know I'm certainly ordering more stuff from home and having them delivered at home. So what's that mean across the nation?
So there's literally tens of millions of parcels and packets coming into Australia through international mail and through air cargo. By air cargo, I mean, FedEx, DHL, those sorts of, methodologies. There's been an exponential increase even before, the closures in Victoria. In Australia, we were at what we previously would have called Christmas levels.
Right.
But it's not Christmas, and it's been there a long time.
So every day's Christmas Day.
Every day's Christmas
Australian
now.
Border Force.
So we're having to celebrate by pushing a lot more staff into that area of operation.
Yes.
Because people use the term unsustainable Christmas levels. Well, it may be the norm for the next 2 or 3 years.
Right.
So we're having to work very closely with industry because they're having to increase their footprint. You can imagine if you're running a logistics company and you've got double the volume of items you have to process, you're going to have to create more floor space. So new warehouses, and that creates challenges for us in the supply chain too.
So talk me through the methodology of how do your people make decisions about which box to look at, which 100 to let through? What's the sort of process that informs that type of action?
We rely on our integrated cargo system and the data that sits therein. And of course, overlaying that with intelligence. So we do take a very targeted intelligence risk-based approach to what's coming across the border. We can't search every parcel and packet. We can't possibly screen them all. So we have to take a very risk-based approach. And we have a lot of intelligence analysts and data scientists behind the scenes who are supporting us in that endeavour so that our officers at the front line are not having to guess which parcels and packets to open. Of course, what I would say is I think, given those volumes though, we will have to add to, in the future, I think, that intelligence data-driven model. We have to continue to evolve that. But I think given the scale and the volume of goods coming across our border and the technologies that are now becoming available, screening technologies like CT scanning and automation and AI, and you can imagine algorithms driving some of that screening in the future, whether it's sea containers or air cargo. I think that we will have to employ technologies over the next decade that allow us to screen far more of what's coming across the border in real time, so we don't slow industry down. But rather than using human beings to look at the X-ray image, that'll be computer driven, that'll be algorithm driven.
Now, I've been through one of your facilities in Brisbane. I've seen some of the methodologies that's associated with, for example, testing containers. It's just astonishing to see the ways in which illegal material can be hidden on these. And, we're talking about large, complex things that take up space and require a fair amount of forensic effort if you're going to, really go through a container to be absolutely certain whether it's carrying material or not. How far can technology assist you with this, or is it always going to be a sort of a human-driven process that will absorb, countless hours of time?
No, I think that technology will assist us greatly in the future. I believe that in 10 or 20 years' time, our screening technologies will be integrated with the supply chain technologies. The screening will occur as a container comes off a ship. That screening will occur as parcels and packets are taken out of the belly of airplanes. And the second line of defence will then be our intelligence and data to target our activities. And of course, the automation, the use of algorithms and data will free up our officers actually to do more of the high-end enforcement work that we need them to do.
That's interesting. I wanted to touch on, I guess, a related but slightly different area about human trafficking. Very interesting program on Four Corners this week, which was talking about human trafficking of basically sort of Eastern European labourers into the UK, which was not something I'd ever really considered to be a target of interest to human trafficking. What's the story in Australia, and what kind of problems does that present for you?
Well, of course, in Australia, we're not immune from criminality of any type, including human trafficking or modern slavery. What it means for us is that when we go out and do our field operations, for example, in relation to the agriculture industry, and we find foreign workers who may be being exploited because they're being underpaid, or they're on the wrong visa types. They might arrive you on electronic travel authority from one country, or a student visa for another, or a visitor visa from another, and all of a sudden we find them working in a particular sector. It may be agriculture, it may be somewhere else. And what we're finding increasingly is that we're getting what you might call these sort of labour hire intermediaries, as they're called, and some migration agents who are facilitating large-scale exploitation of labour. Now, if you apply that to, say, the sex industry, then there's a chance that worker may well be significantly exploited in some sort of debt bondage in relation to that. Yeah. And that has happened in Australia. The difficulty here, Peter, is that a lot of these victims won't speak up.
Yes,
they don't want to tell you that that's their situation. The other thing I would say about that we are doing here is that we have some landmark legislation in Australia, the Modern Slavery Act, and we are responsible for managing that in the Australian Border Force. And that requires large Australian companies to declare in their annual reports what they're doing to ensure there's no slave-like practices within their suppliers, within their supply chain. So it requires them to do due diligence in their supply chain to ensure that the goods and services coming into Australia aren't the product of people being, subjected to those sorts of conditions. Yeah. It's a modern problem, and I'd say that COVID-19 has probably globally exacerbated that because of course, there's less work.
Yes.
And of course, people are in more dire need, and criminals, unfortunately, will always exploit that. So we're not immune, and we have seen quite large-scale and unearthed quite large-scale organised visa fraud and migration fraud, which brings foreign nationals into Australia on for example, bogus documents, and they get here and claim protection, and they end up working in a particular sector. And this is a large problem for us to continue to investigate and deal with.
Can you help us understand the nature of what modern organised crime actually means? I mean, as you sort of survey this field, what are we talking about? I mean, are there like 10 major cartels in the world which kind of divide it up between them? Is it thousands of little criminal gangs? What's the degree of sophistication that they apply?
I think there's a lot of different levels and a lot of different crime types. So some criminal groups will obviously focus on the trafficking of narcotics. Profits are huge, and it requires there's a global supply chain. And cartels, as you call them, are linking together across the globe out of different continents. And they're, of course, able to, because of the money they generate, almost legitimise what they do in certain countries and hide behind sometimes legitimate businesses. And the ACIC and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission and the Australian Federal Police, of course, in the Commonwealth context, lead the charge in that regard, and we support them and link in that. But also with modern slavery and other crime types and organised frauds, you see other sometimes the same criminal groups and sometimes other groups, they diversify. So I wouldn't say this is a one-size-fits-all. And all I would say is that crime is becoming more complex. There's this sort of mingling of legitimate businesses and transactions and people with illegal. And so it's very hard for investigators to unpick all of that sometimes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, your comments did touch on the insider threat, I guess, which in this context is really about people that are facilitating the illegal movement of goods through, I guess, otherwise legitimate supply chain arrangements.
Yep.
How big a problem is this? And then let's use that as a segue to talk about the sort of cooperation, as it were, with legitimate business and legitimate industry. But let's start on the dark side first and the sort of insider risk that you were talking about.
So I'd say it's a problem. I think the vast majority of our exporters and importers and people at supply chain are honest, do the right thing, pay their dues. That's the first thing I'd say. But there's enough, I'd say, there's enough of a problem in there for it to get my attention. So when you add a few things together, we've got the wastewater analysis, 8 tonnes of meth being consumed a year. The UNODC estimating that 70% of all importations by sea container are using trusted insiders. Just those two factors alone tell me we need to be doing something. Now, we in the ABF are responsible for licensing depots and warehouses and customs brokers, and we also, obviously, Commonwealth level, also issue maritime security identity cards and aviation security identity cards. Within all of that system, I think we have to start to look really seriously for where the vulnerabilities and the problems are, and look for the technological and the legislative fixes to it. And we are actually working with the AFP as we speak in relation to tightening up the supply chain integrity, because I think it's incumbent upon us to do something about it.
Let's talk then about the legitimate side of cooperation. You sketched out a world where, in fact, the need is for the border force to be sort of more disaggregated around the country. And I guess part of that thinking is to link more tightly and more immediately into the private sector and to business interests. What's the agenda for that? What do you want to get from business? And, how's that going to evolve? At least how would you like to see that evolve over the next few years?
So in the last 12 months, to give you an example, I've established a customs advisory board. And on that board, I brought in CEOs or people at a very senior level from the private sector to give me confidential advice in relation to our ideas and policy thinking around how we can deploy technologies and undertake our regulatory functions at the border in a way that gets a win-win. Industry is not going to want to invest a significant amount of money in technology at the border if it's going to come at a cost to them and slow them down. Moreover, the Commonwealth government's not going to want to do that either. So we have to together undertake pilots and trials and tests to flesh out the business case. So on the one hand, demonstrate that over time, there'll be a payback, there'll be productivity gains that will pay for the technology to be employed. Now, it requires a lot of trust. So the advisory board is an example of that sort of mechanism. Beneath that, of course, we've established the Australian Trusted Trader program. So this is where people who work in the supply chain and exporters and importers can apply for accreditation as a trusted trader. And that means we go through a whole accreditation process to give ourselves a level of assurance that that particular entity, that we can attach trust to them and give them, if you like, a lighter touch at the border. We're signing up with mutual recognition agreements with other countries with whom we trade around the world, who have similar programs in place. The idea being then, if you start to employ technology to back that up, that you can actually create secure trade lanes where goods can move literally straight across the border, straight to into the supply chain and to the end user or consumer, without us actually having to interfere with it at all.
Right.
And the way we collect duty, the way we defer duty collections, and the benefits we give to trusted traders are quite significant. I think that program and that concept will grow into the future, and we're already in discussions with New Zealand and other countries about the establishment of those secure trade lanes.
Can that concept be rolled out eventually to individuals as trusted travellers that might receive a lighter touch as they go through? I mean, what's the story about that?
Well, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it could be, of course. It then comes down to people who are willing to allow us to use their biometrics to facilitate that. I mean, I envisage a board. Why couldn't an airport in the future allow you to simply walk into an airport overseas, check in without having to show a passport, get on an airplane, walk off the airplane to a baggage carousel where there's all the duty-free and retail outlets wrapped around the baggage carousel, get your bag and depart the airport. Yeah. And if there's a problem, a smart gate at the back of the baggage hall would close on you, perhaps, because your face on the move is being monitored. We know who you are. We know you've got a visa or you're an Australian citizen. We know that there are no security concerns around you, etc. For a system like that to work, we have to bring in data around who you are, your biometrics, the information in the background to be able to check you constantly. And if you apply that to a COVID world, you start to bring in potentially health type information and travel patterns and those sorts of things. It would require, I think, a conversation around privacy that we would always hit up against. And so I think for certain travellers who are willing to, and it's happened in Europe and in the United States, where certain travellers are willing to sign up to a particular program to enable them to travel more freely.
Yes. This is a sensitive issue for me, Michael, because in travelling to the United States and, you do your fingerprint things, what I have discovered over a number of years now is that apparently I have a fingerprint. I'm not even sure which one it is. That is the spitting image of Pablo Escobar's fingerprint. And so I have been hauled into a number of interview rooms to be asked some really strange questions that you don't think would really apply to a guy working in an Australian think tank. I gather there's now a note on my sort of passport data as I enter the United States. But, the technology, it seems to me, is amazingly promising in terms of the potential it has, as long as people can sort of get themselves into a situation where they're able to, as you say, have that trusted background to establish what they're doing and how they're travelling. But let me change gear really and talk about a different issue. Ruby Princess, we could not talk about that. And of course, this is a particularly COVID-related story of the challenges of bringing people back into the country, potentially with carrying the virus. and what turns out to be an amazingly complicated set of relationships between federal and state authorities and jurisdictions. Not on the specifics necessarily of the event, but what's your take on the lessons that emerge from the Ruby Princess story?
It was immediate. So once the passengers had disembarked the Ruby Princess, and of course, I'd point viewers to the Walker inquiry report in terms of an unbiased source of truth around what actually happened with the disembarkation. But immediately on the back of that, myself, New South Wales Police, Mick Fuller, New South Wales Health, what we had to worry about was the crew. And we worked collaboratively and resolved that problem. And at the same time, we had a ship called the Artania in Fremantle with crew and passengers. And we had to work with Western Australian Health and police and others to resolve that particular challenging situation. So I think that improved collaboration, knowing what each other's roles and responsibilities are, being clear about handoff points and accountabilities, all of those things. The border, as I said earlier on, is a complicated system. And there's state laws, there are Commonwealth laws, there are a whole lot of organisations that work at the border. I think that the degree of collaboration that we showed after, I think, the disembarkation of passengers in New South Wales was key to how we will have to operate in the future. COVID-19 could be with us for a long time. We don't want a similar event to occur again.
We have a question here from one of our watchers asking about the situation concerning leisure yachts and sort of small personal craft like that. What types of challenges do they present for Border Force?
They're a challenge. I mean, we have to treat yachts the same as any other vessel coming to Australia, and those that are carrying non-Australians, they require an exemption in order to enter Australia under the Migration Act. So they have to apply before they arrive for an exemption, because at the end of the day, they would have to go into state quarantine. So we do, through Maritime Border Command, track all of the yachts in our waters, and there are processes in place for yachts to seek permission to come into port internationally. And of course, we work with the Department of Infrastructure and the states and territories in relation to that, the same way we do with airlines and airport passengers coming in. I'd say that at the moment with COVID-19, the number of yachts that are coming, has gone down significantly, so it's not a huge problem for us right now. Although I'm aware of a lot of yachts in our region in the South Pacific, and of course we're getting into cyclone season, so there may be some demands for people to try and come to Australia. But we'll work with the states and territories in relation to their quarantine capacity in relation to that.
That's a good segue to what I wanted to talk about next, which was your interaction with a range of foreign countries. And we have a nice comment here from George from Fiji. He says, not a question, but a comment. Just wanted to thank the Commissioner and the ABF for the immense contribution they've made to trade and border security in the Pacific. So that's a nice comment. But talk about the Pacific and indeed, if you like, how we interact with a country like Fiji. What's the role of Border Force in the context of Pacific Step Up, and what are the challenges that you're facing?
Yeah, so we work very closely with partners in the Pacific, and Fiji is a great example. We've recently worked with Fiji to implement a container control program where the customs service in Fiji has been able to create a border targeting capability to target containers arriving into Fiji that present a risk. Now, we did that in partnership with UNODC, of course, and with Fiji. So that was a great partnership effort. But also, we have the Oceania Customs Organisation, where we work with partners around the region in terms of our regional security. We share a lot of concerns regionally about vessels that are coming through our waters for nefarious reasons at times. In terms of the Step Up, we've been very aligned with DFAT, with Defence, with the AFP, because they all have strong partnerships in the region too. And so the establishment of a fusion centre in the region was something that we supported DFAT closely in relation to. Moreover, with Defence and the AFP, we've established last year the first joint heads of Pacific security meeting, where we brought together Defence, or naval and Army leaders, police leaders, but also, importantly from my point of view, customs and immigration leaders, because the border, I don't think, is always seen as being a strong means through which a country can manage its sovereignty and manage the security and the economic threats and opportunities that we spoke about earlier on. So I've been really promoting the role of customs and immigration in that security construct in the Pacific. And in fact, in November this year, we're about to have a a virtual heads of Pacific security discussion. Unfortunately, we can't all get together, but we're still going to continue on with that discussion as to how we can collaborate, share information, and what initiatives we can put in place jointly to improve the security in our region.
I mean, there's a strong capacity building agenda there, because we're talking about countries with more limited capacities to be able to manage the flow of goods in and out of their countries. Sort of how much investment or how much invested effort happens on the part of your organisation to build that capacity? And where would you like to sort of take that in coming years if you have the opportunity to do more?
Yeah, we do a lot of bilateral work. So firstly, in the last few weeks, I've had bilateral discussions with Fiji, who are obviously online, and all with Papua New Guinea. And both those nations, I have a very warm relationship with the heads of their organisations, as do my officers. I have a senior Border Force officer who's working out of Wellington, who's got an entire focus on the Pacific. And we've had offices in Fiji, establishing the container control program, and we've been assisting countries around the Pacific in doing border security work. So we put quite a lot of effort into it. And also, as I said earlier on, the Oceania Customs Organisation is an area that I think that we, Australia, can work more closely with partners in the Pacific in relation to border issues. The World Customs Organisation, some of our Pacific partners are members there, and we also collaborate regionally through that forum. So I'd say that we put a lot of effort into the Pacific and into partnerships in our region generally. Bear in mind that we have Maritime Border Command as well, and so we have a maritime interest in the Pacific too, and we certainly do a lot of work with defence and the Pacific partners in the maritime security, civil maritime security space as well.
We were talking before the interview about China, and I think it's worth just bringing the nature of ABF cooperation with Chinese counterparts up as well. What's happening on that front?
Well, at an operational level, I mean, recognising there's obviously a lot being reported in the press, and there's a lot going on diplomatically and geo sort of politically and strategically. But at the operational level, we've got very good relationships with, for example, the Anti-Smuggling Bureau in China. And we rely on the Anti-Smuggling Bureau a lot for information intelligence about goods that are being smuggled from China into Australia, for example, around tobacco. And we've had a lot of excellent detections in Australia on the back of great information that the Anti-Smuggling Bureau have given to us. We've also had strong partnerships traditionally down the years with the GACC, the Administration of Customs in China. And those relationships are being maintained, and we're still working collaboratively at the operational level with those organisations. And given the volume of goods that come to Australia through mail and through air cargo and sea cargo from China, it's important operationally, I think, that we maintain those relationships.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think it's no secret to say that a significant amount of methamphetamine and methamphetamine precursors comes from China.
That's right.
So do you think the organisational relationships you have with Chinese authorities is adequate to manage that problem? I mean, I guess there's always more that you would like to be able to do, but if you were able to sort of shape that relationship in a more comprehensive way, what would you want to be able to do to deal with that methamphetamine risk?
Really, I suppose it's about influencing the system in China at the border, and in terms of the regulation of certain industries. So it's not necessarily strictly in our bailiwick, but obviously, the sort of chemical industries in China and some of the places where these pharmaceuticals are being produced is of concern, and then of course it's how they're being exported, but it's not all directly from China. We do have strong relationships though with, as I said, with China. We're participants with the AFP as well, I might say, because the AFP have a lot of skin in this game. But we do participate with China and Hong Kong in a 3-country, 5-partner dialogue regularly. We have offices obviously embedded in China, liaising with Chinese counterparts. And we engaged with China in terms of World Customs Organisation regionally and globally in relation to the regional heads of our Asian Coast Guards meetings that we're a member of as well in China too. So there's a lot of multilateral fora that we also engage with China. And so we'd always like to do more, I think, in China and with China, given the scale of China and the impact on our border. But I'd say that we're not in a bad place operationally.
Well, I can see from our questions that we've got something of a global audience here. We have a question from a person based at Indo-PACOM in Honolulu asking, what do you see as the biggest challenge to mission accomplishment, i.e. funding, manpower, technology? All three, I guess, is the answer.
Well, clearly, even if when the border starts to open again, we say a signal increase in hopefully goods going both ways to and from Australia and economic prosperity and travellers, I'm not going to get an exponential increase in the number of officers I have. I'm not asking for that. So we've got to find different ways to manage volume. We have to find different ways to identify the threats and the risks. And so partnerships, collaboration, technology, the way we do that. Now our officers, of course, what I've learned through COVID-19 is that our officers are incredibly agile. They were able to move seamlessly from airports into cargo and other areas of operation. We haven't traditionally worked like that. We're going to have to build on that for the future. And so training that agility into our operating model, but into our DNA as an organisation is going to be vital for the future, so we can move from left to right and back to left again in a heartbeat as we need to respond to these sorts of challenges. So I think in terms of manpower, it's about agility, flexible operating models. In terms of technology, it's how do we make use of the data that already exists in the supply chain, within industry, in airports, with airlines, and those without having to ingest it all. So we have to find far more efficient ways of understanding where the threat and the risk is, and overlaying that with our intelligence, and collecting intelligence is going to be key. Working with partners like partners in Honolulu in relation to the Pacific is going to be key.
We haven't spoken about asylum seekers, and we have a few questions which relate to that. What do you see as the future for ABF in terms of the asylum seeker problem? I mean, this is clearly not something that's as strongly in the headlines as it was a number of years ago now, but there are many factors impacting on people movements through the Asia-Pacific region, so it's not impossible that it could come back again. What's your take on the challenges that presents?
Well, we're constantly vigilant. Operation Sovereign Borders hasn't gone away, and it's obviously sits within the ABF at the moment. We sort of look after the headquarters component for Operation Sovereign Borders, and so we are constantly monitoring what's happening in obviously the transit and source countries for people smugglers. And at the moment the threat is low, but we're all around our region. You're right, the displacement of people, the movement of people, because of whether it's for political or for other reasons, is of concern. Looks like in Europe. And we are working with countries in our region so we can understand and be on top of what the threat might be. What the prospects might be. We haven't taken away our on-water presence, and we maintain that, particularly, obviously the northern approaches, but also our aerial surveillance. So all the mechanism, the system of Operation Sovereign Borders is still there, very present, because we have to be eternally vigilant. This is one of those scenarios, I think, that we cannot afford to allow the people smugglers to get a foot in the door again. Yes. Because it's very hard to get that foot out the door once it's in. Yes.
Not unrelated to this, we have a question here about the capabilities of the Cape class vessels, and the thrust of the question is to say that there are some inadequacies in how these ships are operating. What's your view on that? Are you satisfied with the capability they present you, and what's the future of the sort of offshore maritime capability for Border Force?
Yeah, look, the Cape's a very able vessel, I'll say that, and coming into the Border Force in 2015 from the law, as you mentioned earlier on, my background, it wasn't much to do with ships. So I didn't have much knowledge, but I've obviously engaged a lot with defence and Navy in particular since, and the Capes are being pushed out much further and being pushed much harder than anyone imagined in 2011 and 12 they would be. We're pushing them out for 28 days, sometimes over 1,000 nautical miles, and sometimes in pretty tough seas. And when you think about Operation Sovereign Borders and the job they've done, the capacity to hold people when they need to, they're a very able vessel. Now, have we had problems with, mechanical elements? Of course we have. These ships get driven hard. We're about to get to the sort of midlife point in the Capes. And we're starting to think now about what the next sort of configuration of them might be. That's the first point. So I'm happy with the Capes. In other words, they do a great job, but like all ships, Navy tell me, they're hard to maintain, and you're never going to be problem free. Yes. So I'd say that in terms of the future, I think that we will always need to have an enforcement presence on the water in a hull of some sort. But it's how you cue us onto the threat is the issue. So I think the surveillance then is the key. The vessels themselves are not there to do surveillance. The chances of bumping into a yacht that's full of drugs by happenstance in the ocean are very, very small indeed. So we need to be queued onto something through Maritime Border Command. And that's why the aerial surveillance, the satellite surveillance, drone technologies, linking with defence, and defence are a key partner here. Even now, you know, we get access to sometimes the P-8 Poseidons, which are very capable aircraft. And of course, defence provides with a great amount of support in terms of our civil maritime responsibilities. So I think more sort of UAV type technologies will be deployed. I think that satellite technologies will evolve and give us more situational awareness as what's happening on the water, so we can be more accurate and precise in where we deploy our resources to. But at the end of the day, you always need somebody in uniform out there on the water to employ the enforcement effect.
Yes.
And that's where the capes come in.
Yes. You're sketching out quite an impressive technology future for the organisation, but of course that comes at a cost.
Yeah.
And you've also made the point that you're unlikely in budget circumstances to be getting more people. So what's the bill, Michael? I mean, if we are able to make use of all of these important emerging technologies, you mentioned artificial intelligence earlier, how's that going to play out in terms of pressures on your budget? And do you think there will come a point when you'll need to go to government and say, hey, we simply need more to be able to take advantage of this new technology?
I suspect that'll be a regular conversation with government, if I'm being honest, because, you know, as you mentioned with the capes and we've alluded to, 10 million square kilometres of exclusive economic zone to monitor and be aware of what's going on. That requires a lot of technology. And the technologies, as you know, don't come cheaply. However, I do think we can continue to evolve our relationship and partnership with the Department of Defence, because Defence have also acquire a lot of assets that could potentially be dual purposed and support us in our mission too. So I think there's some economies of scale potentially that we'll need to identify down the track, and maybe leverage off each other's contracts and those sorts of things. You wouldn't want sort of two navies and two organisations doing the same thing. That would make no sense at all. How though we as a Commonwealth get better value out of contracts and industry and those sorts of things is going to be increasingly important. So people with contract management skills, tendering skills and those sorts of things are going to be increasingly important too. We shouldn't forget the front end of the process here. These contracts have a tail for years.
Yes.
We need to get them right in the first place.
I mean, one area where Defence is actually, I think, doing very well right now is in the construction of the new offshore patrol vessel, which is a larger capability than our Customs and Border Forces ever thought about. But can you see a case for a vessel of that sort of size becoming something that might be of interest to Border Force?
And we have to potentially, we have to look at those opportunities for platforms, I think, that could be dual purposed. Yeah. But we will also need to guard against, though, I think, a scenario where all of our on-water capability is so sophisticated and so expensive, it makes no sense to use it for the civil maritime security mission. So I don't need a guided missile destroyer.
No.
So I think we will continue to have to work with Defence in the shipbuilding program to make sure that the platforms aren't overkill. That we can get benefit from them, and we're not spending too much.
Michael, we've just got a few minutes left, and I wanted to end on sort of the human story of Border Force. I mean, you mentioned it was 6 years of operation. That's been quite a cultural journey for the workforce. And of course, leading cultural journeys is a challenge. What are your thoughts sort of looking back on that? And, what next for the culture that you're trying to build inside the Border Force? That's
a really great point. So I'd say the last 5 years or the first 5 years of our organisational life was about establishment and integration. Bringing together strong cultural, organisations in terms of customs and immigration in particular. And we've obviously then established Department of Home Affairs in the Home Affairs portfolio. But I think that COVID-19 has been galvanising in that regard. I think what we realised is we've come much further on that journey than we thought. We've become much greater than the sum of the parts that were integrated in 2015. And I engage regularly with my people now on virtual drop-ins, so Teams. Rarely am I getting that conversation that I was getting all the time 5 years ago, which is about customs and immigration, customs and immigration, customs and immigration. I think we've come a long way in that journey. We've brought in a lot of people from other walks of life, private sector, other parts of public service, defence, and and policing. And we're not a police force. I mean, we're a law enforcement agency. But the roles I've described in terms of collection of duty, facilitation of trade, These are not policing functions. So we have to juxtapose our facilitation credentials with our enforcement credentials. So we have to be professional and disciplined and organised as a law enforcement organisation, but we can't be just rigid in that regard. We have to have many more strings to our bow. So I think our culture is well positioned for the future. We've got to keep on nurturing and building it. And of course, training, our college and our recruitment, and we've just literally putting in place a strategic workforce plan to position our workforce for the next 5 years so we can deliver on some of our promises and deliver in terms of economic recovery. Leadership is one of the core competencies for doing that, and the way we lead, the way we behave, the way that we reward performance and leadership behaviours, and the way we challenge those that we don't subscribe to is also vitally important, and people right at the top in relation to that.
Your own journey is an interesting one because you've served in a variety of quite different organisations that have their own culture. The London Metropolitan Police Service with New South Wales POL, the Federal Police, Crime Commission, now Border Force. What's your own sort of reflections on what you've learned from that experience working in a bunch of different organisations, each with very powerful internal cultures? How have you managed to sort of move so successfully between those different organisations?
I think you've got to be adaptable. I mean, obviously, I've learned so much from every organisation I've worked in, and at a high level observation would be that I've been amazed at how the culture and the way we do things around here in organisations is almost a reflection of the persona of the CEO on occasions. It's been quite interesting. But also what it's given me is the opportunity to look at the same problem from different angles. Because I think every organisation takes, a slightly different lens on, puts a slightly different lens on the same problems. And it's enabled me just to see how different organisations think about whether it's law enforcement. So for me, law enforcement, when I was doing corruption, it wasn't so much about putting the head on the spike in terms of arresting and prosecuting somebody who's done something wrong. It was understanding how that happened, the system within the organisation that enabled that corruption to flourish. So I'm very grateful for my career journey and all the organisations I've worked in. So I've learned so much, and it's given me the ability to look, I think, at the same problem from a lot of different points of view at the same time. Yeah.
This has been a fascinating conversation, Michael. Thanks so much for taking an hour of your time to spend it with us, to spend it with our audience. I think we've learned an awful lot. And can I say thank you for your service and, good luck for the challenges which will be there in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, Peter.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks to all of our listeners. I hope you've enjoyed the experience, and stay tuned for the next ASPI webinar, which is actually not that far down the track. I'll be talking to Ambassador A.B. Culverhouse, the United States Ambassador here in Canberra next week. Thanks again for watching. Bye now.